Dracula's reign of terror had already engulfed most of Europe, leaving a trail of carnage in its wake. His vampire armies rampaged through major cities, attacking in broad daylight with no fear of the sun. The once safe hours of the day became a bloodbath, as civilians were slaughtered in the streets, their bodies drained and left as hollowed husks. Entire nations fell into chaos, with governments powerless against the supernatural invasion. Held captive in Dracula's underground lair, Logan was subjected to relentless bloodletting. Dracula no longer required Wolverine's blood. His immortal body had permanently absorbed it, granting him immunity to the sun. But his armies were not so fortunate. Their temporary resistance to sunlight would wane after 2 days, forcing them to depend on a constant supply of Wolverine's blood. His mutant healing factor keeping him alive despite the brutal extraction process. As Dracula stood atop a crumbled cathedral in Rome, he gazed over his kingdom of shadows, watching his armies ravage the land. The vampire lord grinned darkly, knowing that with Wolverine as his eternal blood source, the sun would never again stand in his way of his army. Switchblade, now fully empowered by the ancient god-eater Atum, descended upon Earth with a presence that shook the planet to its core. Fresh from his chaotic visit to Asgard, his aura radiated a menacing intensity, distorting the very air around him. The Earth was on the brink of annihilation, caught between the forces of Dracula's sun-walking vampire legions, the looming threat of Onslaught's return, and Switchblade's unfathomable power. From the crumbling skyline of a ruined city, Switchblade surveyed the devastation with cold, merciless indifference. Civilians fled in terror, their screams lost beneath the heavy footfalls of advancing vampire hordes. The once mighty defenders of Earth watched from the shadows, paralyzed by the scale of the threats converging upon them. Meanwhile, Charles Xavier, once a beacon of hope and peace, teetered on the edge of madness. Overwhelmed by grief and rage from the brutal massacre of his X-Men, he was losing his grip. The shattered psychic block within his mind had unleashed raw, unbridled psionic energy, allowing him to walk again but also threatening to awaken Onslaught, the Omega-level nightmare born from his darkest thoughts. The sheer force of Xavier's anguish cracked the earth beneath his feet as he struggled to contain the evil stirring within him. Switchblade landed in the heart of the ruined metropolis. His presence alone sent shockwaves rippling through the broken streets. The ground splintered beneath his boots, and buildings groaned under the pressure of his mere existence. He slowly turned his gaze across the desolate city, unfazed by the carnage. "This world," he murmured, his voice carrying with it a dreadful resonance that seemed to vibrate through reality itself, "is a battlefield waiting to happen, with death waiting, a stage for gods and the undead." Dracula's forces carved a path of devastation, clashing with scattered resistance groups across Europe and beyond. The once proud defenders of Earth, humans, mutants, and enhanced beings alike, were being torn apart by the vampire horde. Towns fell into ruin, their streets slick with blood as Dracula's sun-walking legions swarmed through city after city with unstoppable brutality. A small contingent of surviving heroes, led by Dr. Strange, had gathered in the shadows of the ruined city. Their faces were gaunt with exhaustion, their spirits stretched thin, but their eyes were defiant. Cloaked in the residual power of the Darkhold, Strange floated forward, his hands glowing with protective sigils. His eyes narrowed as he locked onto the towering figure of Switchblade, the man who was once Blade. "Atum," Strange called out with commanding resolve, ignoring the corrupted moniker Switchblade had adopted. His voice echoed with ethereal weight, resonating through the fractured city. "You've turned this man into a weapon of destruction, but his soul still fights you." Strange's hands trembled slightly with the effort of probing through the layers of dark magic and godly corruption. "I can feel it." His voice rose with urgency, his mystical aura intensifying. "Release him and leave this realm." For a moment the air fell still. The winds howled softly through the broken towers, and even Dracula's horde seemed to slow their rampage. Switchblade's molten eyes narrowed, and for the briefest of moments, there was a flicker, a buried ember of recognition. The man that was once Blade stirred. But then, a deep, guttural chuckle rumbled from Switchblade's chest. His lips curled into a twisted smile, his sharp canines glinting in the eerie light. "Release him," he repeated mockingly, his voice carrying an inhuman depth that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. "You misunderstand, sorcerer." He slowly stepped forward, each footfall cracking the stone beneath him. He allowed me in. His voice grew darker, filled with malevolent pride. And together, we are something greater. The blade hummed with the essence of Mjolnir's power, and the stolen might of the gods he had devoured. A god-eater reborn. Switchblade's eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction, his voice reverberating like the death knell of a dying world. Dracula and Switchblade stood amidst the wreckage, their eyes locked in a mutual, sinister understanding. Though they spoke no words, their wicked smiles conveyed everything. They were perfectly aligned in their intent. Earth was theirs, not through conquest but through obliteration. Two apex predators united by destruction, both destined to tear the world apart, not for power, but for the sheer pleasure of watching it crumble. The ground suddenly trembled with a thunderous crack, and the skies split open with a flash of divine light. A jagged rift of raw cosmic energy ripped through the battlefield, and from it, Odin, the All-Father, descended. His battle armor shimmered with golden radiance, runes of ancient power swirling across his cloak. His eyes blazed with fury, and the spear Gungnir crackled with world-ending energy. Odin's voice carried with an ethereal weight, shaking the very fabric of reality. "You there, the God-Eater." His voice was sharp, cold, and filled with divine authority. "I am here for you and your transgressions." Odin's glare narrowed, his gaze piercing through Switchblade's soulless eyes. "For the disgrace of Asgard, for the defiling of Mjolnir, and for putting my son into a permanent catatonic state." Odin's hands gripped Gungnir with such force that the runes upon it blazed a fiery white. "It is time to cast you back into the abyss from whence you came." Switchblade's expression was stone cold, unshaken. Slowly, he lowered his katana, forged from the shattered remnants of Mjolnir, and tapped the tip against the ground. The corrupted God-Eater tilted his head ever so slightly, as if amused. "Oh, how noble! The Father comes to avenge the Son." His voice was dark and mocking, each word dripped with cruel satisfaction. "But you're too late, All-Father. I've already buried your legacy." Odin's eyes burned white-hot with divine wrath. Far away in the ruins of the X-Men mansion, Charles Xavier sat trembling in his study. His hands clenched his temples, sweat pouring down his face as he psychically watched the clash between Odin, Switchblade, and Dracula. His heart pounded violently in his chest. "They'll lose," Charles whispered under his breath, his voice shaking with dread. He knew the truth. Even with Odin's divine might and Strange's mastery of magic, it wouldn't be enough. Atum, the Elder God, fused with Blade, was an ancient force beyond comprehension. And Dracula, now empowered with Logan's immortal healing factor and resistance to sunlight, was more formidable than ever. The crimson and black psionic entity writhed within his mind, eager to be free, pulsing with chaotic energy. Xavier's breathing became labored. "There's no choice," he muttered with a trembling voice, his eyes filled with sorrow and resignation. They will die without him. But he knew the cost. He knew that by releasing Onslaught, he would risk not only the destruction of his own mind, but the very fabric of reality. How long would Charles be able to control Onslaught? Sweat dripped from Xavier's forehead. He fell to his knees, his knuckles white from gripping the edge of his desk. "But I can't let them win." He closed his eyes and slowly reached into the darkest depths of his mind, letting the shackles on Onslaught fall away. Share, like, comment, and subscribe for the next chapter.